All right, so we're going to talk about how populations evolve a little more here. This is our third part in this lecture. Again, remember what it takes to cause a population to evolve. You know, the different factors we talked about. I said there's 5. We've gone through 4 of them. Mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, sexual selection, and now we're going into the last one here. The last variable that can cause populations to evolve is natural selection. So this is what Darwin proposed as a mechanism for evolution, is the process of natural selection. So natural selection, the individuals with the most adaptable traits are the ones who are likely to reproduce. So if you are the most adaptable, and there's another term used for this, let me put it in quotes here, it's called the fittest. Now, fittest doesn't mean bigger, stronger, faster. It just means most adaptable, able to survive and pass on your genetics. Sometimes being small is considered fit if you can avoid predators by being small. If you require less food when you're small. That's a great trait, especially if you're on an island. Consider living on an island. If you're a big, giant animal on an island, you're probably going to starve to death. It's hard to find food. But if you're a small animal on an island, you have a better chance of survival. So the key with natural selection, and we talked about the components of natural selection. Go back and review the components of natural selection if they're not coming to you right now. But natural selection is the fittest individual, the most adaptable individuals are the ones who reproduce. They pass on their genetics. Their kids are likely to be fit or adaptable. The individuals who are not adaptable, don't reproduce, they die. Those genes get weeded out of the gene pool. So you take all 5 of these factors, mutation, genetic drift, gene flow, sexual selection, natural selection, and you put those into a population. You put all those factors or pressures on a population, excuse me, and the population starts to change. Now, as the population changes, and a lot of it is because of natural selection, it goes through different patterns of change. So there are 3 patterns of change that populations tend to go through: disruptive, stabilizing, and directional. So natural selection produces these types of selection or change in populations. All right, so what we're going to look at here is the different types and how they work. So our first type of selection is called stabilizing. In a stabilizing selection, when a population is undergoing stabilizing selection, the average phenotype is the most adaptable, or we could say fittest. So let me put that back up here. Okay, being average is the best when you're dealing with stabilizing selection. So we watch a population: birds, fish, corn, chickens, whatever. And the middle of the road phenotype is the best. So in the example here with these birds can lay a whole lot of eggs. It's what they call the clutch size, the number of eggs a bird produces. And what research has shown with this particular group of birds, this population, that if you have 4 or 5 eggs, that's an optimal number. Now, if you have 1 or 2, odds are your kids aren't going to survive. There's not enough because predators are going to get you. And your babies don't survive, the population goes down. So if you're over on this end of the spectrum with your clutch size, probably not the greatest. If you have too many eggs, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc., this end of the spectrum, It's tough to take care of all those babies. You can't feed all those kids. A lot of them aren't going to survive. It doesn't work well. But that 4 to 5 eggs in your clutch, in your nest, that's what we're going to call the sweet spot. So birds that have 4 to 5 eggs, generation after generation after generation, are the most likely to keep reproducing and having their kids reproduce and their grandkids and great-grandkids, etc. That is what's meant by stabilizing. So you start with this broad population, a lot of diversity, and then over time, the average is the most common phenotype and genotype. So the example in humans is birth weight. Human birth weight. If we take 100 babies born in the hospital this week, natural full-term pregnancy, get rid of C-sections, take out premature delivery and technology and all that, just natural delivery, full-term kids, and you take the average of their birth weight, it's going to be around 7 pounds. There's always exceptions here. If we look at the spectrum of birth weight in babies, you might have 3 pounds up to maybe 15 pounds. Here's your spectrum. But if you were to graph this and say, okay, here's birth weight, poundage on this bottom axis, and take a look at kids, you're going to see this bell curve. Most of your kids are going to be around that 7-pound mark. Too small of a baby. Easy delivery, right? But lower chance of survival because they're not as strong, they're not as mature, they're not as developed. Big giant baby. Difficult delivery. Hard for mom to deliver natural full term. So again, think about humans. Let's go back 500 years and women giving birth to a 15-pound baby. Odds are she might have died during child delivery, or both of them could have died. That's why you don't have as many kids being born that are 15 pounds. And I know we all have examples. Oh, it's my friend, they had a 13-pound baby. Yeah, but a lot more friends are going to have babies probably around the 7-pound mark. Go to the small side. 3-pound baby. Easy delivery, right? No. But is that child going to survive 500 years ago if they're underdeveloped and they're a really tiny baby? Probably not. So human evolution over 100,000 years has stabilized our birth weights around the 7-pound average. Okay? So that's one type of selection that gets produced. Now sometimes the average isn't good, and we see populations undergoing directional selection. So in a directional selection, one end of the phenotype spectrum is adaptable or fit. So being really, really big is good, being really, really small is good, but being average is not good at all. So our example here is the horse, and this is shown throughout the evolutionary history of the horse. About 60 million years ago, the ancestor to the horse was this little creature called Hyracotherium, this guy right here. And their body size was fairly small. There's our spectrum. Yeah, there were some really tiny, some bigger, but this is the rough bell curve for horses 60 million years ago. Now, over the course of 20, 25 million years, we see the average body size going this way. It's getting bigger and bigger. Give it another 10, 20, 30, 40 million years, and the average body size keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That was adaptable. To be the biggest horse, each generation was more adaptable. They went from this living in a jungle type of environment 60 million years ago to running across open grasslands in modern time. And being a larger animal was more adaptable. You're big, you're faster, you can escape predators easier. All those traits come together to make you more successful in that changing environment. So that is an example of directional selection. Again, sometimes it could go the other way, and being smaller and smaller and smaller is better, because You hide from predators, you need less food, etc. But directional selection is when the population moves one direction or the other along the spectrum of phenotypes. So bigger, 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 smaller, 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 over the course of lots of generations. So stabilizing is your average, directional is your either end, and the last one is disruptive. Disruptive is when both ends Okay, so disruptive is when both ends of the phenotypic spectrum are considered fit. Okay, so again, being fit or adaptable is the key to survival. What trait or traits do you have that increases your chances of reproductive success, passing on your genetics, etc.? So when populations undergo disruptive selection, what we often see happening is, for whatever reason, both ends of the phenotypic spectrum are fit. They're both doing really well, but the average individual is not. That's not fitness. So let's connect this back to a genetic perspective. Let's say to be this end of the spectrum, you were homozygous dominant, big A, big A. This end of the spectrum, you're homozygous recessive, big A, little a. And in the middle, you're a heterozygote. And for whatever reason, heterozygotes don't do well. They don't survive. They don't reproduce as many offspring. They're not fit. In the snail example here, it's all based on the color of your shell. Predators maybe are eating all the average snails, the heterozygotes, but they're not eating as many of the homozygote dominants or homozygote recessives. So consider if this number of individuals in the population, this decreases, you're over here. When you reproduce with another member who is also homozygous, go back to our Punnett squares, all of your kids are homozygous dominant as well. So that's going to increase the frequency of that type of individual in the population. Take the recessive individuals. If they're reproducing with recessives, then you're going to have all recessive kids. Now, if a recessive and a homozygous dominant reproduce, then you would get heterozygotes. But for whatever reason in this population, the heterozygotes don't survive. They're out of the gene pool. So as this continues, as these selections continue, whether it's disruptive, whether it's directional, or it's stabilizing, what you're doing is changing part of your population. And when you change the population enough that it cannot reproduce with other members of the population, we then say you've undergone speciation and you have a new species. So with our snail example, if this started and over the course of, it says time, really should be generations, over the course of many, many, many generations, lots and lots and lots of generations, we have this split, then we will reach a point, or the population will reach a point where now there's a barrier here. There is a barrier that prevents these individuals from reproducing with these individuals. It might be a physical barrier in regards to, well, physically we cannot fit our parts together to reproduce. It could be a social barrier. Well, I don't like light-colored snails, so I'm not going to reproduce with a light-colored snail. I'm always going to reproduce with a dark-colored. But when we reach that point that the population has changed enough to not be able to reproduce with the other members or another similar population, again, we say, hey, now we have a new species. So in our next lecture, what we're going to talk about is, as this process moves forward, as generations happen and generations and selections occurring, when it reaches a point of speciation, what prevents them from coming back together? Why do we not see these two populations reproducing and it eventually going back to this bell curve type of idea? We'll get into that in the next chapter in the next series of lectures.